The year was 1944, and the war had already consumed the lives of millions. But on one desperate morning in the hills of southern Italy, a young man that the United States Army had nearly turned away would do something so extraordinary, so impossible, that even seasoned veterans would struggle to find the words to describe it. He was not the tallest soldier. He was not the strongest. The doctors who examined him had serious doubts he could survive the physical demands of combat. But on that single day, in the mud and fire of one of the most brutal campaigns of World War II, Private First Class Charles E. Pass, Commando Kelly would earn the Distinguished Service Cross, the Soldier's Medal, and the Bronze Star, 3 separate military honors, before the sun had set. This is his story. Charles Kelly was born on September 23, 1920. And in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, the 9th of 11 children in a family that had never known much ease. The neighborhood where he grew up, the Strip District along the Allegheny River, was a hard place. Steel mills, tenement buildings, cold winters, and little room for sentiment. His father worked whatever jobs he could find. His mother held the family together with the kind of quiet strength that never makes the history books but shapes everything around it. Charlie Kelly learned early that life was not going to hand him anything. He would have to fight for everything he got. That lesson would serve him well, though in ways no one could have anticipated. When the war came to America on December 7, 1941, Kelly was 21 years old. Like millions of young men across the country, he walked into a recruiting station. The Army looked him over and had concerns. Kelly was not in poor health exactly, but he was lean, wiry, not the picture of the robust combat soldier the Army had imagined filling its infantry ranks. There were questions about whether he could hold up under sustained field conditions. There was talk of assigning him to a support role. Kelly had other ideas. He pushed back. He argued. He made his case with the kind of stubborn Pittsburgh determination that would become his defining characteristic. The Army, needing men, ultimately assigned him to the 36th Infantry Division, the Texas National Guard division that would soon be thrown into some of the most savage fighting in the entire European theater. The 36th Division landed on the beaches at Paestum in southern Italy on September 9, 1943. This is part of Operation Avalanche, the Allied invasion of mainland Italy. It was one of the most difficult amphibious operations of the entire war. The Germans were ready. The Luftwaffe came in low over the beaches. Artillery shells walked up and down the sand. Men who had trained for months, who had crossed an ocean and believed in what they were fighting for, died in the surf before they ever reached the shore. Kelly came through the landing. He was assigned to Company L, 143rd Infantry Regiment. The regiment's motto was simple: first to cross. They had no idea yet how much crossing they would have to do. Italy in the autumn of 1943 was a nightmare landscape. The Allied commanders, including General Mark Clark of the Fifth Army, had hoped the Italian campaign would be swift. The Germans, under the command of Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, had other plans. Kesselring was a brilliant defensive strategist. He looked at the Italian peninsula, its mountains, its rivers, its narrow valleys, and saw a perfect place to make the Allies bleed for every mile. He established a series of defensive lines running across the spine of Italy. The Germans fortified hilltops, mined roads, destroyed bridges, and positioned their artillery with devastating precision. Every Allied advance cost lives. Every ridge taken revealed another ridge behind it, bristling with machine guns and mortars. The 36th Division fought through Salerno, pushed north through the mountain towns of Calabria and Campania, and by October 1943 was locked in brutal combat around the Volturno River. The fighting was close and personal. Riflemen crawled through vineyards and olive groves. Artillery pounded positions that were sometimes only a few hundred yards apart. The weather turned wet and cold, turning dirt roads into rivers of mud that swallowed vehicles whole and made every step a physical struggle. Men who had been fighting since the beaches were exhausted in ways that no amount of rest could fully repair. Kelly earned a reputation in these weeks. He was reckless, some said. He was aggressive. He had a habit of moving forward when common sense might suggest moving back. His squad mates both admired and worried about him. He carried himself with a kind of coiled intensity, as if the war had given him a purpose he had never quite found in the streets of Pittsburgh. He was not performing bravado. Something deeper drove him. But he seemed genuinely unafraid in moments that terrified other men. Whether that was courage or something else entirely, the men around him were not sure, but they wanted him close. The date that would define Charles Kelly's life was September 13, 1943, though the full account of his actions would take days to be officially documented and confirmed. The fighting around the town of Altavilla Silentina, perched on a hill above the Selle River plain, had been going on for days. Altavilla was critical. Whoever held the high ground there could control observation and fire across a wide section of the plain. The Germans knew it. The Americans knew it. The fighting for that hill was some of the most vicious small-unit combat of the entire Italian campaign. Kelly's unit was ordered forward into positions around a stone farmhouse complex that the Germans had heavily fortified. The morning opened with artillery on both sides. The air smelled of cordite and smoke. The olive trees that dotted the hillside had been stripped of their leaves by shell blasts, standing like charred fingers against the gray Italian sky. Men crouched in ditches and behind stone walls, waiting for orders they knew might be the last they ever received. The German counterattack came before noon. They came in strength, infantry supported by machine gun teams, with mortar crews dropping rounds into Allied positions with sickening regularity. American units began to fall back under the pressure. In the confusion of a retreating defensive line, gaps open up, and gaps in a defensive line get men killed. Kelly, but seeing the crisis unfold, made a decision. He was not ordered to do what he did next. There was no officer standing behind him with a directive. He simply acted. He grabbed a Thompson submachine gun and moved toward the sound of the German advance. Not away from it, toward it. He positioned himself at a window of the stone farmhouse, which offered both cover and a clear line of fire into the approaching German infantry. He opened fire. The Germans did not immediately understand what was happening. A single man, firing from a fixed position, had no business stopping an infantry assault. But Kelly kept firing, reloading, firing again. When his ammunition ran low, he called back to other soldiers, demanding more. Men brought it to him. He burned through it. The German advance slowed. The machine gun teams that had been supporting the assault shifted their attention to Kelly's position. Rounds chewed into the stone walls around him, sending chips of rock flying like shrapnel. He stayed. He kept firing. His accuracy was described by witnesses as remarkable. He was not simply spraying rounds in the general direction of the enemy. He was choosing targets, firing, and choosing again. For what seemed to those watching like an impossibly long time, one man in a farmhouse window held a section of the German advance in place. When the Germans sent a flanking team to get around his position, Kelly moved. He did not retreat. He repositioned. He grabbed additional weapons from fallen soldiers. A bar, a Browning automatic rifle that he used to engage the flanking movement. He was hit by debris at least once during this period. He kept fighting. But the morning was only the beginning. As the day wore on, the tactical situation around Altavilla remained desperately fluid. American casualties were mounting. Stretcher bearers were working under fire, dragging wounded men back through terrain that offered almost no cover. The aid station was overwhelmed. Medical personnel were running out of hands. This is where Charles Kelly did the second thing that would earn him a medal that day. He stopped fighting forward, turned around, and began pulling wounded men out of the open ground. Exposed under fire, he moved from casualty to casualty, dragging men, some of them larger than he was, some of them unconscious, some of them barely alive, back to positions where the medics could reach them. He made multiple trips. Each trip took him back into ground that German snipers and machine gunners were actively watching. The soldier's medal is awarded for heroism not involving direct contact with an enemy. What Kelly did in those minutes on that hillside was precisely that. Heroism that saved lives not through combat but through selfless disregard for his own. He could have stopped. No one would have blamed him. He had already done more than any reasonable expectation could have demanded. The Germans were still out there. The artillery was still falling. The day was far from over. But Kelly was not finished. The afternoon brought a new crisis. A section of the American perimeter near a cluster of stone buildings was in danger of being overrun entirely. Ammunition was critically low across multiple positions. The resupply chain had been cut by German fire, and men were reporting that they were counting their remaining rounds by the handful. In that situation, without adequate ammunition, a defensive position collapses. If it collapsed, the men inside it died or were captured. Kelly understood this with absolute clarity. He organized what amounted to a one-man ammunition run. Moving under fire, exposing himself repeatedly, he collected ammunition from positions that had become untenable and carried it to positions that needed it desperately. He coordinated with other soldiers, directing them with an authority that had nothing to do with his rank and everything to do with the force of his personality and the clarity of his thinking under pressure. In the chaos of that afternoon, Kelly functioned as a leader, an organizer, a supply line, and a fighting force all at once. When the German pressure intensified again toward evening, Kelly was back at a firing position. He had been fighting, moving, carrying, and fighting again for the better part of 12 hours. He was exhausted in ways that the body can barely sustain. And still he kept going. By nightfall, the American position around Altavilla had held. It had held in part because of Kelly. The German assault had not broken through. The wounded had been evacuated. The ammunition had reached the men who needed it. The line had not collapsed. None of those things were inevitable. Each of them required someone to make a choice to act rather than to wait, to move forward rather than back, to accept risk rather than avoid it. When the official accounts were compiled and the witness statements were gathered, the Army found itself looking at something extraordinary. In the course of a single day, Charles Kelly had performed 3 separate acts of heroism that each on its own would have been sufficient to merit formal recognition. Together, they constituted one of the most remarkable individual performances of the entire Italian campaign. The Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest military decoration the United States can award, was given for his combat actions at the farmhouse window, for holding a position alone against a German assault when withdrawal would have been understandable and perhaps expected. The Soldier's Medal was awarded for his actions in recovering wounded men from open ground under fire. The Bronze Star recognized his leadership and courage in the ammunition resupply effort that helped hold the American perimeter through the afternoon. 3 medals, 1 day. One man who was very nearly told he was too weak for combat. Kelly's war did not end at Altavilla. He continued to serve with the 36th Division as it fought its way northward through Italy. The division crossed the Rapido River in January 1944, one of the costliest single operations of the Italian campaign, an assault that failed under withering German fire and left hundreds of men dead in the water and on the riverbanks. Kelly survived it. He continued to serve through the fighting around Monte Cassino, through the breakout from Anzio, through the liberation of Rome in June 1944. He was eventually discharged after further injuries. He came home to Pittsburgh, a city that understood hard men and hard work, and found himself celebrated in ways that seemed to embarrass him more than please him. He was not comfortable with the attention. He was not a man who had fought for recognition. He had fought because there was fighting to be done, and he had been there to do it. In 1944, his story was told in a book. He was received at the White House. His face appeared in newspapers across the country. America needed its heroes in those years, needed proof that the men it was sending across the ocean had what it took to face the worst the enemy could throw at them. Kelly was that proof, embodied in a lean kid from Pittsburgh who the Army had almost turned away. He lived until 1985, dying in Pittsburgh at the age of 64. He was buried with full military honors. The men who had served with him, the ones still living, spoke at his funeral about the quality that had always seemed to define him. It was not fearlessness exactly. Fear is human, and Kelly was entirely human. It was something else, a refusal to let fear make his decisions for him. A stubborn Pittsburgh insistence that what needed to be done would be done, regardless of what it cost. The hills above Altavilla are quiet now. The stone farmhouses still stand in some places, their walls scarred in ways that the decades have slowly softened but not entirely erased. The olive trees have grown back. The small towns of southern Italy, the ones that watched American and German soldiers fight and die in their fields and streets, have rebuilt themselves and moved on through the years. But in the ledgers of the 36th Infantry Division, in the citations written by officers who watched what happened on September 13, 1943, the record remains clear. 1 man, 3 medals, a single day that should not have been survivable. The Army had worried he was too weak for combat. Charles Kelly spent one September day in the mountains of Italy proving, beyond any argument, that strength is not measured in the way a man looks standing in a recruiting office. It is measured in what he does when the artillery is falling and the line is breaking and every reasonable instinct is screaming at him to find a place to shelter until the worst is over. Kelly never sheltered. He never waited for the worst to pass. He walked directly into it, again and again, all day long, until the day was done and the position was held and the wounded were safe and the ammunition had reached the men who needed it. That is what heroism looks like. Not the heroism of the movies, clean and certain and lit from the right angle. The real kind, muddy, exhausted, sustained across 12 hours of terror and noise and loss, driven by nothing more complicated than the knowledge that something needed to be done and no one else was doing it. Private First Class Charles E. Kelly, 36th Infantry Division, United States Army, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. 3 medals in 1 day. The soldier they almost turned away. The soldier who, when the test finally came, refused in every possible way to fail it.